The fate of Gowron was decided by two captains. In one instance, he was granted command of an empire. In another, he lost his life. Two crises, two choices, and the story of how the Federation and the Klingon Empire would never be the same. The Klingon Empire has long been defined by strength, tradition, and political upheaval. But in the span of just a few years, two crises would not only shake the Empire's foundations, they would entangle the Federation in ways that would test its more sacred ideals. In the 2360s, Captain Jean-Luc Picard stood as a symbol of diplomatic restraint, overseeing a bitter civil war from a distance, bound by Federation law. He intervened only to expose foreign Romulan interference, never to decide Klingon leadership itself. By the late 2370s, Captain Benjamin Sisko faced a different kind of crisis. A Dominion war that threatened the survival of the entire Alpha Quadrant. And this time, neutrality was not an option. Faced with a failing ally, Sisko quietly encouraged, some would say ordered, the removal and even the death of the Klingon Chancellor. At the center of both moments was one man, Gowron. Once seen as a champion of Klingon reform, Gowron's fate would be sealed, not by his enemies, but by the decisions of two Starfleet captains. When the Klingon Empire fell into civil war, Starfleet faced an impossible choice: protect an ally's stability or uphold the Federation's core principles of non-interference. Captain Jean-Luc Picard, bound by both orders and personal conviction, chose restraint. As arbiter of succession, Picard's role was not to favor any side, but to ensure the right of succession remained free from outside influence. Even as the Duras family, corrupt, power-hungry, and secretly backed by the Romulans, threatened the Empire's future, Picard refused to take direct action against them. His intervention came only when evidence of Romulan interference surfaced. Even then, Picard moved carefully, cutting off the Romulan supply lines, but never taking a position on who should rule the Klingon Empire. Picard's philosophy was clear: the Federation must remain neutral, even when neutrality risked enabling corruption. In doing so, he preserved the letter of Federation law and the spirit of its ideals, but he also left the Klingon Empire to resolve its own destiny, without direct guidance or aid. The gamble worked. Gowron seized power, the Duras sisters were defeated, and the Empire emerged battered, but intact. Yet even then, seeds of future instability had been planted. Gowron's leadership, though legitimate, would prove to be far more complicated and far more dangerous than Picard could have foreseen. Captain Benjamin Sisko faced a very different Klingon crisis. By the late 2370s, the Dominion War had engulfed the Alpha and Beta Quadrant. The Federation, Klingons, and Romulans were locked in a desperate fight for survival. But within the Klingon Empire itself, a different danger was growing. Chancellor Gowron, once a symbol of reform, had begun to erode the war effort. Fearing the rising popularity of General Martok, Gowron orchestrated a campaign of sabotage, assigning Martok to reckless, hopeless assaults meant to bleed away his forces and his influence. These politically motivated attacks were not only wasting Klingon lives, they were weakening the very fleets needed to hold the Dominion at bay. For Sisko, the danger was clear. If the Klingon Empire collapsed from within, the entire war effort, and the survival of the Alpha and Beta Quadrants itself, could collapse with it. The Federation could not afford to lose the Klingons as allies, and Captain Sisko knew something had to be done. Unlike Picard, Sisko did not merely observe events from the sidelines. He called Worf to his office and set a course for intervention. Quietly, unofficially, Sisko encouraged Worf to challenge Gowron according to Klingon law. Though Sisko never gave a direct order, his meaning was unmistakable, and Worf understood what had to be done. It was a calculated move, one that risked Worf's life, and threatened to reshape the Klingon Empire's leadership in the midst of a galactic war. Some would argue that Sisko, in that moment, ordered a political assassination. Others would say he preserved the entire Alpha Quadrant by ensuring competent leadership endured. Sisko acted not out of respect for Klingon sovereignty, but out of necessity. And in doing so, he made a choice the Picard of the 2360s might never have dared to make. When Gowron first rose to power, he represented hope. Backed by Picard's impartial arbitration, Gowron overcame the corrupt Duras family and assumed leadership of the Klingon High Council. He promised a new era for the Klingon Empire, one rooted in honor, free from the scheming politics that had weakened it for generations. And for a time, he delivered. Under his rule, the Empire regained strength, renewed its ties with the Federation, and helped confront the greatest threats of the age. But during the turmoil of the Dominion's rise, Gowron was deceived. A changeling, disguised as General Martok, manipulated him into abandoning the Federation alliance and embracing a policy of fear and aggression. Though the impostor was eventually exposed, the damage to Gowron's mind and leadership remained. From that moment forward, Gowron became a man at war, not just with his enemies, but with the very ideals that had once elevated him. The weight of power is heavy, and over time, Gowron, like so many leaders before him, began to lose his way. Jealous of rivals, suspicious of loyalty, fearful of being overshadowed, Gowron transformed from reformer to tyrant. When Martok's victories in the Dominion War made him a hero, Gowron did not celebrate him. He sought to destroy him. Reckless orders, suicidal missions, political sabotage disguised as military strategy. It was not just Martok's forces that suffered. It was the entire Klingon war effort, and by extension, the future of the Alpha and Beta Quadrants. The once hopeful Chancellor who had stood against corruption had now become its embodiment. And in doing so, Gowron set in motion the events that would lead to his own downfall. Not at the hands of an enemy, but at the hands of his own people. In the age of Picard, the Federation believed its greatest strength was its ideals: non-interference, respect for sovereignty, diplomacy over force. Even when facing the Klingon Civil War, Starfleet clung to those values. It was better, they believed, to risk instability than to compromise their principles. But by the time of Sisko, the galaxy had changed. And ideals, once proudly defended, became luxuries few could afford. The Dominion War was not a political dispute. Not really. It was a war for survival. Survival demanded hard choices. And survival demanded that the Federation recognize a grim truth. Sometimes neutrality was not moral. It was cowardice. Where Picard had respected Klingon sovereignty, even to the brink of chaos, Sisko understood that in war, failing to act could be as deadly as firing the first shot. He was not reckless. but he was no longer bound by the comforts of peacetime diplomacy. Sisko's quiet encouragement to Worf to challenge Gowron and restore effective leadership was a turning point. It marked the moment when Starfleet's high ideals gave way to the cold realities of wartime survival. The Dominion War forced Starfleet to reconsider what survival meant. In the age of Picard, neutrality had been a principle of strength, a way of proving that ideals could outlast fear. But in the crucible of war, neutrality became something else, a luxury, a liability, a risk that could no longer be afforded. Sisko's quiet encouragement of Worf to challenge Gowron was not an isolated act. It was a reflection of a broader transformation inside the Federation itself. Starfleet was no longer simply defending its ideals. It was now manipulating outcomes behind the scenes, shaping events to ensure survival, even at the cost of those ideals. Diplomacy gave way to strategy, idealism gave way to pragmatism, and the Federation, once the shining beacon of moral restraint, learned to embrace subtle forms of interference when survival demanded it. Worf's challenge against Gowron, endorsed not by Klingons, but quietly by a Starfleet captain, was just one of the many small fractures in the Federation's self-image. It would not be the last, nor would it be the most severe. In time, even Sisko himself would confront the cost of survival, the moment when morality and necessity would no longer coexist. For the Klingon Empire, leadership has never been a birthright. It is something earned and challenged through strength, honor, and victory. The right of succession, the duels for control of the High Council, the constant tests of loyalty and valor. These traditions are not flaws of their society. They are its foundation. Klingons do not believe in passive leadership. When a chancellor grows weak, when they endanger the Empire through cowardice or self-interest, it is not merely the right of a challenger to act. It is their duty. Gowron, who once rose by these very traditions, ultimately fell by them. When Gowron's pride and political ambition began to bleed the Empire's strength, it was Worf who stood against him, not out of personal hatred, but to protect the Empire itself. In challenging Gowron, Worf honored the deepest codes of Klingon culture. He did not act as a Starfleet officer. He acted as a Klingon. In the Federation, such actions might have been seen as treason or assassination. In the Empire, it was a restoration of honor, a necessary reckoning. But even victory came at a cost. For every act of honor in Klingon society, there is an equal shadow. The knowledge that strength, not principle, determines who survives. Picard and Sisko both faced crises that challenged the Federation's ideals, but the paths they chose revealed fundamentally different approaches to leadership. Picard embodied diplomacy. He believed in the power of patience, the importance of principle, and the strength of example. Even in the midst of civil war, he trusted that the Klingon people would find their own path, without direct Federation intervention. His leadership was measured, focused on restraint, built around the belief that ideals could, and should, survive even the darkest moments. Sisko embodied pragmatism. He understood that in a time of existential threat, patience could be fatal. That sometimes, to preserve the larger ideals, hard decisions had to be made in the shadows. Where Picard waited, Sisko acted. Where Picard preserved neutrality, Sisko shaped outcomes. Neither man betrayed the Federation's core values, but each revealed a different interpretation of what leadership required when peace was no longer guaranteed. Picard showed that restraint could be strength. Sisko showed that survival sometimes demanded intervention. And together, their choices painted a fuller picture of what the Federation was, and what it was becoming. When the Federation was founded, it was built on a simple idea: that ideals mattered more than fear, that diplomacy could outlast war, that unity could overcome division, that morality could survive contact with power. For most of its history, the Federation lived up to that promise, but survival changes even the strongest ideals. In the crucible of the Dominion War, the Federation faced a truth it had long resisted: that in order to survive, it might have to become something else. It was not a fall into villainy. It was something quieter, a willingness to bend, just enough to endure. Sisko's encouragement of Worf to remove Gowron was not an anomaly. It was part of a larger pattern. The Federation learning to manipulate outcomes when opening diplomacy failed. The price of survival was not simply bloodshed. It was the quiet erosion of the Federation's certainty that ideals could stand untouched by necessity. The Federation survived, but something within it changed. And perhaps that change was inevitable. In the end, the fate of the Klingon Empire was decided by two Starfleet captains: Picard, who chose patience over interference, and Sisko, who chose survival over neutrality. Neither man was wrong. Each reflected the Federation's spirit in their own time, one clinging to ideals, the other adapting to survive. The Klingon Empire endured. The Federation endured. But neither would be unchanged. Leadership is not measured by purity. It is measured by what a leader is willing to sacrifice and what they refuse to surrender. Picard preserved the Federation's soul through restraint. Sisko preserved its future through difficult choices. Two captains, two choices, and the long, uncertain shadow of survival.